Hello, my name is Greg Niemeyer, and I'm a professor at UC Berkeley for media innovation. And I'd love to talk to you today about data cultures, data arts, and I'd love to talk about data models and questioning data models. So I will record this meeting for you here. I assume that you'll watch it in 2x speed. So I will try to speak slowly and I also will share the links with you in chat and an email so you can watch the slides on your own and follow links on your own. But to get started, let's share the screen and look at questioning data models. You can also follow me on my website, look at more projects, and on my Instagram below. But first, let's talk about what data is. Data, to me, is an element of an archive. And so here's a quick overview of what we have. We have an archive that contains a record, and the record contains a column or key and a field, and whatever is in the field, that is data. So it's the fundamental unit by which we build archives, and from archives we draw observations, and from these observations we draw conclusions, and from these conclusions we draw actions, which in turn produce new data, which we can use to verify if the actions we took had a desired outcome and impact. And so that is actually a feedback loop of data, action, data, action, data, action. And to me, what's fascinating about data is that it's actually quite abstract. So when we take temperature, this is obviously a picture from Europe because it's 39 degrees Celsius. But when we take temperature, we are making an abstraction. We're pulling the data away from a body and we're entering it into the archive. But if we think about that and a little bit and take action on it later on, then we take that data that is now abstract and turn it back into an action, then we make it concrete again. So we go from abstract to concrete, or from virtual to physical, back and forth many, many times as we use data, collect data, use data, and use it to take action. So that being said, when I think about data models, I always want to think about where the person is in the data. Where is the real person that the data has been abstracted from? And also, where is the person who is impacted by the application of decisions based on that data later on? And of course, this question doesn't only extend to persons, it also extends to the whole planet we live on, our whole ecosystem. And we can always ask, where does the data come from? Where is it drawn from? And where is it going to be put back into? And where is it going to be pushed back into? So these, I think, are very important questions to ask when we want to understand what data does and how to take responsibility for data. They're parts of what I would call a data culture. A data culture is something similar to a cinema culture. In cinema culture, we talk about movies we like all the time. What movie did you see last night? Was it good? Was it bad? What did you like about it? What did you not like about it? Even if you're not a director or an actor or a screenwriter, you still can talk about, or a producer for that matter, you can still talk about a movie as an experience, as a part of culture. The same is not true for data yet. And we're getting slowly to a point where we can speak about data the same way. What kind of data did you see last night? Was it good? Was it bad? Was it inspiring? Was it uplifting, depressing? What did it cause you to change in your life? How did it impact you? And I'd like for us to move there and move away from this sort of expert domain notion of data towards a data culture. So we can all participate in it, even if we're not the producers or directors or mathematicians or statisticians directly involved with the data. We're all impacted by it. Therefore, we should all experience it as a part of our culture. So that requires some kind of literacy. And the key component is that I'm talking about in terms of data literacy today is going to be questioning data models. So questioning data models. First of all, is data a mirror or window? There's a comic book artist, Jean Luen Yang, and he talks about books being mirrors or windows. He talks about books that are mirrors that allow you to see yourself, but also books that are openings in walls that you built, and those openings show you a different world beyond the walls that you are confined by. So both things lead to insights that you wouldn't have otherwise. And I think that's a very beautiful way to think about data as well. Some data is a mirror that shows us who we are, and sometimes we see things that we would not like to see. But sometimes data also operates as a window, an opening towards something we'd like to see and didn't know was beyond the walls we live in. And so these are metaphorical concepts, obviously, but data can also shut us in. Data can be the wall, and rather than it being the wall that we build around ourselves, it should be a mirror or a window. And that has to do with the data model. A data model describes what we collect, how we quantify things, what we measure, what we don't measure, how often we measure it, who we share it with, who owns the data, and these various aspects of data models can make or break a mirror or window, or data can become something that can obstruct our view because we're paying overly too much attention to it, and we overfit to that data, or it can become an expansion of our view because it opens us up in these two directions, more self-awareness or more awareness of the world. So here's an example. When is data a mirror or a window? Here's an example of a building in Berlin that does a whole bunch of interesting things. First of all, the facade is a mirror. It reflects the environment around it. But of course, the facade also is full of windows so people inside can see out. And at the same time, this mirror is not really reliable. It's a distorted mirror. It shows the same thing twice. It doesn't show other things. It's selective. And when we think about data models, I'd like to always keep in mind that a data model can be a window for some and a mirror for others, but it also can be an incomplete mirror and an incomplete window. It can exclude some things, include others, and that's a very good question to ask. What does my data model include? What does it exclude? What does it distort? What does it represent? What does it represent disproportionately? And what does it underrepresent? And so this image kind of summarizes it all. And beautiful building in Berlin. And as usual, if you want, there's a source that you can follow here to understand more about where this image comes from. So onwards, questioning data models, objects or streams. Another aspect of data models is that indeed we could have a model that says the data has been collected from Monday to Friday. We didn't care about the weekends because, I don't know, people don't commute on weekends, or whatever. Or we could say we're going to create a data model that is more like a stream, where every day you can check in what the latest status is. So for example, air quality would make perfect sense to make that a stream. You want to measure it all the time. It changes all the time. You wouldn't want to do a study of a neighborhood and to say measure it from Monday to Friday and measure air quality from Monday to Friday and then stop measuring on Saturday and Sunday, because that would be an incomplete assessment. And but oftentimes we do that. Oftentimes we make a study that says here's a beginning, here's an end, and we sort of create a box around the data that is temporal, a temporal box that really limits the kind of the kind of continuity of insights that we could gain from a continuous stream of information. I think that a stream is more important than an object. And this drawing here by John Henry Fuseli refers to that in a way. So in this drawing, we have a mysterious hand reaching for a ball that is being passed by, that is being also held by a group of 3 women who seem blind or looking down. And this is actually a very dramatic moment in Greek mythology, where Perseus, the hero, who's sent out to kill this terrible Medusa monster, needs to find out where the Medusa lives. So in order to do so, he goes and looks for the Graiai, and the Graiai are 3 sisters that among them only have 1 eye and 1 tooth. Where's my eye? 1 eye and 1 tooth. So they are going to they're going to struggle really hard if they can't have their eye, and they're going to struggle really hard if they can't have their tooth. So the eye is a model, as a metaphor for a continuous data stream, because we have to keep looking in order to make sense of the world. We have to keep looking in order to make sense of the world. So Perseus meets these Graiai, and the Graiai have one piece of information he'd really like to have, a static piece of information. They know where the Medusa lives. Perseus does not know where the Medusa lives. He sees them passing their single eye among them to see where they are in this cave and where they live in. And he snatches their eye and says, "Ha, I got your eye now. You can't see anymore. I will give you your eye back if you tell me where the Medusa lives." So he extorts, it's an extortion, right? He ransoms the eye for the information. And they say, well, we really need our stream of data. We really need our eyes. So we will tell you where this Medusa lives and who is related to them. And in return, give us our eye back. And Perseus gets the information, and being an upstanding, noble hero, he actually does give the eye back to them. And this is the moment we see here. So we see static information, object information being traded back for streaming information. And so what is your data model? Is it a stream or an object, a fixed object? And oftentimes we make it too simple by saying, oh, the object is fixed and we're going to stop studying at some point, but we never should stop studying. We should always seek to establish data streams, especially now that we can do that with the technologies we have. So this leads to the question, when is data alive or dead? And how do we store data, and how does it enter an archive? How do we keep an archive going? Because sometimes you collect data, but it gets lost and it rots because maybe the file is getting corrupted, or you didn't back it up and you erased it, or it's in a library and the library burns down, or it's in a book and the book is lost. There's enormous amounts of information that we lose all the time. And so how can we keep data going? And I think one example, how can we make it survive? And of course, one concept is that we keep copying it from one place to the other. And another concept is that we store it securely. And the tree is an interesting metaphor because the tree has tree rings, and the outside of the tree, between the bark and the wood itself, is the living surface of the living area of the tree. And the bark really is dead, and the wood really is dead. But the living area creates a shield around the archive. And that's kind of what we need to do. We need to, the people who are alive now need to create this shield around the archive of data that they need to maintain in order to understand their own culture, identity, future history. And so that's a powerful metaphor. And I think it's really inspiring. But also the tree, of course, has a wonderful way of telling its own story. It holds on to its own history and literally protects it from the outside influences. A twist on that is a really wonderful dendroglyph here from 1900, a photograph from Australia, from New South Wales, showing how Aboriginals in Australia used trees as markers for graves and carved into the trees the icons that represented the person that's buried nearby. And so this says there is a person buried under this tree or near this tree, and this is their family, this is their life, this is their story, and please respect this location. And of course, the tree stands for much longer than a human life. It can go for 1,000 years. And so it's a very reasonable place to make an archive. So the tree, in a way, although it's damaged in one area, with its life, it protects the data that is carved into it. You see that sometimes too with lovers carving their initials into trees and parks. So although they do it in the bark, and the bark eventually falls off. So if you really want to be committed, you got to go a little bit deeper in it. You got to go beneath the bark into the wood itself of the tree. So again, on the source, you can follow up more on dendroglyphs, a beautiful story, and we'll come back to Aboriginals later on. Some remarkable photograph as well. Unfortunately, many of these trees have been cut down and put in museums, or used as trophies from colonial explorers, taking these kinds of things home and saying, this is what we found in the colony down there, and they thereby destroyed the culture, the Aboriginal culture that was there, and of course the Aboriginal people as well. So it's a complicated image to consider because it both celebrates a Aboriginal tradition, but it also marks its demise. Because of course the Aboriginals didn't take these photographs, it was the colonials that took these photographs. So let's look at data model fallacies. You can build into your data model mistakes. And here I want to do a quick excursion, and here's a quick trigger warning. I'm going to show a scary skull, a preserved skull of a person. This is Bentham. Bentham was a inventor of the panopticon, among other things. And he was also a philosopher, very progressive philosopher in Britain. And he was talking, he wrote a book about fallacies. And in his book about fallacies, he sorted out 4 different categories of fallacies, or tags for fallacies. He said fallacies can either be logical or material. They can be either accidental or intentional. So when we make a data model, it can be riddled with fallacies, and it can be logical, like we thought about it, about the data the wrong way, or they can be material. The measurements were faulty. So they also can be intentional. Oh, we're going to measure it the wrong way so that we can prove that, in fact, let's say, there are no owls in this park, in this land, and so we don't need to protect the owls. So we can just measure the owls the wrong way and say, you know, measure them during the daytime and they're hiding instead of during the nighttime and they're invisible. So that would be an intentional fallacy to mislead the public or an agency about the presence of owls. It could also be accidental, a fallacy. You could say, you simply make a mistake. Oh, the camera was broken, that's why we didn't see any owls. Or it could be logical. We could measure the owls with cameras that are, you know, mounted on the ground instead of in the trees. So there's all sorts of ways to make a data collection go wrong. And the interesting thing that Bentham was looking at is that the intentional misguiding of data collection and data models is as possible and likely as the accidental misguiding. And the types of errors can be logical or material. This is a very useful map to refer to. So another classical example of a logical error is a false binary. So for example, we have gender. Gender often is considered male or female, but many people, especially in recent times, started identifying as neither male nor female. They can refer to themselves as they, or as transgender, or as you know, agender, genderless. And so when we start classifying a population in terms of male or female, well, you will miss a whole group of people, maybe a very important group of people, maybe a culturally significant group of people that don't identify as male or female. So if your data model doesn't include an option for other for gender, then you force a false binary and you lose data, you lose authenticity, and therefore it may lead you to false conclusions. So that's an example of a logical fallacy, and that could be accidental. Oh, we didn't think about it, or didn't know about it, or intentional. Oh, we don't want to include transgender people in our study because of bias, right? So that would be a terrible example, but that happens all the time. People often create databases that have intentional bias built right into it, so they don't see what they don't want to see. You can't change what you can't measure, but if you don't measure something at all, you also can't even see it. So that's why formulating a data model is so important. Here's a brief detour. We want to talk about Frankenstein for a moment, because Frankenstein had all sorts of fallacies built into him. And it just goes to show that a fallacy can really ruin your life. So, you know, if you remember, Frankenstein, the novel, involves a monster being created by a man named Frankenstein. So the monster actually remains nameless. But the creator of the monster is a fellow named Frankenstein. Young Frankenstein is a student, just like many of us, and he goes from Geneva, where he lives with his family, wealthy, well-to-do, noble family. In the 19th century, he lives there in Geneva very happily in a little castle by the sea. But he has terrible melancholy, and he wants to go ease his melancholy by going to study. So he goes to Ingolstadt, where there's a university. Then he builds his own lab, and then he creates the monster, and the monster runs around, and he is terrified by the monster because he's terrified. So that's right there, a reason for creating false data models, fear. But because the Frankenstein is terrified, he runs away, and his monster sits around saying, "What do I do now? I'm alive, but I can't figure out what's going on. I want to learn something, and nobody's helping me." So the monster grows increasingly bitter because precisely his creator refuses to teach him something. So he refuses to pass information about the world, the archive, if you will, onto the monster. The monster would be very happy if only the monster could learn some languages and some arts and cultures and maybe some data science as well, and participate in society, because the monster wants to be normal. And so there's several confrontations between the monster and the inventor. And the fallacy here is a fallacy of control. Frankenstein thinks he does not have control over the monster, but in fact he does initially. However, as the monster grows more powerful and more bitter, that shifts. The locus of control fallacy flips. The Frankenstein thinks he can kill the monster, evade the monster, or run away from the monster, and he thinks he has control at that point, but he doesn't. So that's the reverse locus of control fallacy. And then the rest of the novel deals with the various places they run to and escape to figure out their relationship, Frankenstein and the monster, that is. There's even a scene where Frankenstein tries to create a wife of Frankenstein so that Frankenstein can reproduce, but then destroys that partner, and Frankenstein again is frustrated and eventually destroys the partner of Frankenstein, Frankenstein's bride, and kills her on their wedding night. And so eventually they all run off into the Arctic ice and never to be seen again. So that's a tragic outcome for what happens if you are subject to fallacies, if you misinterpret the world around you. You think opportunities that you do have, you actually don't have, and opportunities that you do have, you don't realize that you have them. So some things are possible and you don't think they are, and some things aren't possible and you think they are possible. So that would be a terrible fallacy. And that's what can happen if your data model is wrong. You think some things are one way, but they're actually not that way, and other things are a different way, and you think they are the way they are misrepresented. So a false data can get in the way of seeing what's really going on. That's called an opportunity cost, and it's called a blinding. Also, you can be blinded by false data. So Frankenstein certainly was blinded by false data and caused him a lot of trouble. So then, instead of being blinded by false data, we can ask questions about data models, such as, what is worth our archiving? By whom? How can it be archived? What does the archive include? What does it exclude? How does the archive model its holdings? How does the archive show what's there? What categories does the model set up? Are the categories including any fallacies, yes or no? Are there structural, logical, material fallacies in the model? Are there false binaries? Are there false categories? Are there tags that make no sense? Are there noises? Is there fake data that's been manipulated? Is there bad data that shouldn't be there? Is there bias that shifted the data one way or another, say because population selection bias maybe? So these are all questions that can help us avoid the fate that Frankenstein experienced. There's another one that's really deep, which is the fact that data models are an expression of cognitive models of the world. We all have a way of thinking about the world, and that way is specific to the way we were raised. And in 1933, Alexander Luria, a Russian psychologist, proved the significant influence of social life and literacy on the structure of logical reasoning. He observed that the values of indigenous people who are more nature-centered and illiterate at this time than in so nomadic and settled subgroups with the same level of education differed in some neuropsychological tests, revealing the influence of social conditions on logic. Luria confirmed the idea of cultural determination of cognitive processes. Cultural context is as important for cognitive models as literacy. So the way we think is the logic that we pursue deeply affects how we perceive the world. And you can think of the cognitive model as the core data model that we always operate with. And it has limitations. It's not perfect. And whenever we have an accident or a surprise, we know that our model of the world was not perfect. But Luria studied these several groups of people, nomadic subgroups and settled subgroups with similar levels of education. The nomadic ones, though, did not read and write. The settled ones did read and write. And when he studied their way of thinking, he wrote down categories that they formed. And the nomadic ones formed this notion of tree axe table because trees were a resource for them that they could build a table with for a while, and then they would move on. And so they drew upon natural resources to live. Versus the settled subgroups, they classified tree with bush and grass because it was associated with nature, and in other words, with outside stuff. And so there was a category of nature stuff that was outside and that was separate from life inside. But for the nomadic people, actually, the relationship between tree and table was connected by axe, so that formed a more likely cognitive, logical set of terms than tree, bush, grass. And so that's very interesting because it shows how our lifestyles indicate the kinds of models we think through and think with. So flawed models need to be adjusted, and as we grow up and evolve, as both individuals and as a culture, as a species, we revise our models constantly to fit the changing environments and the changing challenges and our changing needs. So keep your data models fluid. Well, here's an example of gender in art, and there's a beautiful set of data that you can look at. The Museum of Modern Art has made a list of all of its artworks. It's called Artworks CSV. You can find it on GitHub. And if you just sort through that, you can see they made a model of the holdings they have, and one of the category, of course, is gender. But the gender category is binary, so it's either male or female. And so you can see a number of things there. You can see that there's 102,000 about artworks in the MoMA that are made by males, and 17,000 artworks that are made by females. So that's almost a one in five or so difference. So you're 5 times more likely to see artwork by a male than by a female artist, even though creativity is evenly distributed among all genders and people. And certainly there's no reason to believe that women are somehow less creative than men. It's just that this imbalance reflects a gender bias in terms of support and opportunity. Interestingly, if we look at the database, we can also see that there are 6,800 no gender people, which might be artworks not made by a human being, but by a machine, or not attributable to a specific person. Male, male might indicate a teamwork. Male, 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 I guess that might indicate 3 people working together. Male, unknown, special category, I don't know. Male, female, that could be a transgender situation or a gender non-binary situation. Nothing, blank, male, and so forth. So if there's a few more female, female, well, that's an interesting category. Just like male, male. So there's a lot of error in there probably as well. And it just is an example of how a simple question such as gender can lead to a lot of trouble. And as it should, because gender is an evolving category. And maybe at some point they can make the gender a floating point number between 0 and 1. Is it 0 being totally female and 1 being totally male, and everything in between is possible as well. Maybe there's other ways of thinking of gender, but binary certainly is not. So I'm going to skip these slides here. I'm going to ask a few more questions. Here's a video you could watch about how to store humanity. If you had to archive everything, what would you archive? What would be important? What would you leave in? What would you leave out? This is called How to Store Humanity. It's a video on the New Yorker, and we're just going to, in the interest of time, I'll let you watch it on your own. It's a beautiful story. It's very moving. What do we keep? Why do we keep it? Well, there's many bizarre archives. Here's one of them. The archive of broken couple stuffs. the Museum of Broken Relationships, a beautiful collection. It shows objects that were important to people as part of their relationship, but then when the relationship fell apart, the objects changed or lost their meaning. And many examples, including rings, of course, that's obvious why a ring might be a leftover from a relationship. Engagement ring, maybe that's an engagement that was broken. There's other interesting objects here as well. It's an interesting archive because we spend so much time worrying about our intimate relationships, and in fact, in a way, we have very little information about what works and doesn't work. And this is an attempt to hold on, maybe nostalgically, maybe poetically, but also maybe psychologically to objects that maybe reveal a lot of important dynamics that we maybe wouldn't pay attention to otherwise. So an archive makes something more important. It holds it up, it preserves it. And this is certainly an unusual but very worthwhile way to hold up an archive. The Berkeley Art Museum is another wonderful archive. It has a whole bunch of films in it and 19,000 works of art, 16,000 films. It is associated with UC Berkeley, so who owns the archive? The university does. It benefits Berkeley students and staff and visitors. What does it include? Well, it includes 19,000 works of art. It includes a whole bunch of others. It also includes an academic audience. It probably excludes people who aren't academically inclined. It looks like an institution that you don't necessarily want to enter if it's not clear to you what's going on in there. It doesn't say this is for everyone, just looking at it from the outside. It says you need to be able to, I don't know, get past these foreboding walls here and have a reason to come in. We're not opening it up so much. It's not very inviting. There's no big wide portal. It feels more like a wall. And so there's many aspects of it that are inclusive because they have free open nights and so forth, but there's also aspects of it that are exclusive that have to do with, is this for me? Is this my culture? I don't know. Will I feel safe there? Will I feel comfortable there? Does it cost something to get in, and so forth? So not everybody feels entitled to enter a museum and get benefit from it. It also is, of course, funded by wealthy people who in some ways are able to implement their agendas by creating museums and by pointing out what is valuable to them. But maybe what is valuable to people inside the museum is not the same thing as what's valuable to people outside the museum. So a lot of things to consider there. Another archive, totally different, is archive.org, the Internet Archive. It is a nonprofit organization, just like the museum we saw earlier, many are. But this one has the agenda to preserve the internet, but also to preserve books for free, make them accessible for free. And so they have a wide range of different archives that they collect. One that's particularly interesting to me is the 78 RPM record archive. And it's got a wonderful set of music from the early recording history, and that has fallen out of copyright because copyright is some 70 years. So music recorded, I guess, up to 1950 would now slowly fall out of the, will fall into the public domain. And there are definitely many recordings before 1950. Maybe the time is actually 90 years, 95 years. And so even so, there's many recordings from the early 20th century that are now falling out of copyright. And so that means out of copyright protection into public domain, that means we can now listen to them. And maybe a lot of records from 1949 here. Yes, it seems like maybe 70 years was the right number. And so you can ask here again, what does it include? What does it exclude? Well, it includes whoever was recorded up till 1949. It excludes everybody who's recorded after that time. And it also excludes a lot of information about the songs themselves. Maybe that can be added later on. But it, for example, doesn't tell us what was the A side or what was the B side. It's just two sides. In fact, they're presented as individuals. So we don't know if maybe this was the B side of this record, or maybe it was. there's kind of an unpeeling of the record. The record now used to be in one object, but now it's two separate objects. The two sides are recorded separately. It doesn't talk about the country of origin, the gender and race of performance. So it has a slight bias there. Maybe it emphasizes the music and the what's written on the label, but it doesn't give more information, more context about the label. Here's another interesting, curious archive. It's an archive of Qing Dynasty emperors and the number of wives and children they had. This was a student contribution to a question like, go research an interesting archive. And I thought it was striking because the number of wives and number of kids ratio seems to indicate something about the waning stability of the Qing Dynasty. Very powerful in 1616, and then something is not working anymore in 1909. And although the emperor has 5 wives, they have 0 children, maybe because the emperor was very young. I'm not sure exactly, but historians can illuminate that. So this archive emphasizes this prerogative of multiple wives and of emperors, of multiple wives, and but it also chronicles a kind of a decline of that concept and the viability of that concept. So it's very selective, very biased, very focused, very limited, but it also tells a story of a decline of that particular dynamic. So here's another rogue archive. You know, the many rogue archives are not official archives. These that we saw before were quite official and quite public, and they're still biased. But rogue archives, they don't have as many rules to follow, shall we say, and they're meant to be archives that are subversive, and they do something that's either illegal or untraditional. And an example would be archives that show Asian TV series, and they're owned by either a non-profit organization or organization interested in earnings from advertising, but they're illegal because they don't pay copyrights. And many fans still want to watch the movies, especially abroad. And so they can do that for a while, but they keep having to look for new websites that host the same movies because the websites get deleted and shut down. So this is a set of archives that are rogue in the sense that they are operating against copyright limitations, and they are operating like Robin Hood for the people, but against the established powers, and certainly against the producers who make the movies in the first place. So what it excludes is legal access to cinema, and of course it's a very limited catalog. What it includes is many TV series that people want to watch in the section of Asian TV series drama. So let's look at some data manifestations. If we have a set of data models that produce data and collect data, we can also ask, how do we manifest data? And of course, the ultimate manifestation of data is the action we take based on the information. But how do we get to that? We have to look at something to take some action. And here's some examples. Here's the classic, I don't know if you've seen this already in your previous studies. It's a classic chart, Carte figurative des pertes, 1869, by Charles Joseph Minard, a French engineer, and he tracked the fate of the Napoleon expedition, Napoleon-led expedition of 400,000 soldiers, 422,000 soldiers to Moscow in the winter of 1812. And that campaign failed miserably because it was a very cold winter, and all the soldiers, except for 10,000, basically died walking to Russia and walking back in the winter. So it was a tragic graphic. And of course, talking about taking action, this graphic was released 1869, some 57 years after the actual event. So it was useless to the people who were there at the time. It was more of an academic exercise and the warning maybe for the future. The only winning move is not to fight when it comes to wars, so don't start a war. But the soldiers who were there in the winter of 1812, they certainly would have appreciated looking at this graph as a projection, as a prediction before they embarked on this disastrous expedition. And if they had seen even a vague projection of this, they would probably have stayed at home, and they would have fared much better, as would have the Russians. So a warning, an actionable warning, sure. A beautiful manifestation, sure. We have a geotemporal graph here. In other words, it shows the evolution of an event over both space and time. And it's a wonderful leverage of the geography, and the width of the line indicates how many people are in the army, and the tones refer to the color, refer to the direction of the expedition, brown going towards Moscow and black going back from Moscow to France. So it's a classic graph, very powerful. Unfortunately, it was 57 years too late. So how can we move from warnings that are too late to kind of predictions? Well, we can look at climate change, for example, and we can look at water stress in the United States. And this shows how climate change produces water stress of different kinds. Some places have too much water and some places have too little. Sea level rise in Alaska and Florida is disastrous, also in parts of California and Washington. But in other places, there's droughts. So how can we have droughts and floods at the same time? Well, that's because the stability that we enjoyed for a long time has been destabilized because we introduced too many pollutants in the atmosphere that cause climate change. So this is maybe similar to this one, a graph that spells out disaster, but it's not too late to respond to it. In other words, we can still move, we can still think about curbing climate change, we can still think about mitigating measures so that we don't have the same fate as the soldiers in Russia in 1812. Here's another graph altogether, and here I want to talk a little bit about aesthetics, and I want to talk about how bare bones this graph is here. This is really a graph that speaks only to reason, and in Greeks call that logos. So in rhetoric, you can distinguish between three fundamental ways in which people try to convince each other of something. So one is logos, the rational path. One is pathos, the dramatic path. And three is ethos, the path of beauty. And the dramatic path would have lots of extremes, lots of drama, lots of death, lots of red and black, and just dramatic things happening all the time. And that grabs our attention. The path of reason here is the detached, cold, clinical, but rational and very authoritative approach that that seeks to get our attention and engagement by appealing to our reason, right? This makes to an engineer, this makes a lot of sense. To other people, maybe not so much, but it seems very serious, and so maybe it'll convince people just because it looks so serious. Here's a map of a different kind of network that also tries to talk about networking. You see, this is the global submarine cable map, but it is definitely not like this. It is definitely not appealing to reason. It is much more appealing to ethos, because they tried to make the map as beautiful as possible. They brought in a little bit of an old-time aesthetic, but they did map out the location, route, and name of various submarine cables. I especially like Aphrodite 2, is a lovely name for an underwater cable. And so there's a detail to the right, and there's the overview to the left here, and you can follow up again in the source where this comes from. Telegeography produced this in 2015. A very compelling example of making something beautiful in order to make it convincing. Here maybe is a teenage pathos. This is my daughter drawing a map of when she has fun during the day, and so she tracked herself for several days and made this fun chart, or this hedonism chart, when she's happy. And it looks like movies are definitely high time, and then free time is good. No math is also good. Lunch, food is good. Dance is sometimes good, sometimes bad. So this is a kind of a dramatic map. Also the handwriting there seems to speak to some kind of life drama happening there. Going to bed seems to be a no fun time at all. I think it's very funny, because actually I love going to bed. It's always good to sleep. But when you're a kid, I guess going to bed is just horrible. So here's an example of pathos, but also this is an example of sonification, because what she really was doing was mapping this out and then playing it on her clarinet so that she could make it a music out of her various states of mind. Making music out of data is something I love to do, so I'm very proud of my this as well. I'm going to speak about a few projects here that you might want to check out from my website as well. This is a project called Zarbel, where I tried to rebuild the sound of them with a bunch of colleagues, of course, as usual. I often collaborate, rebuild the sound of the Zarbel based on a mathematical calculation of what it would sound like. So this is using sound to manifest the bell. The bell is broken, but what would it have sounded like? That's what I'm trying to get at. And then I'm leading in here to the next project, the Cave Bell, which is maybe inspired by The Mystery of the Tolling Bell, a Pulp Fiction novel. But sometimes you hear mysterious ringings of bells in caves, and I was elaborating on that by making a bell that actually makes the sound, that manifests the sound of water flowing inside and outside of the cave. This is in Australia, and in a project we did in Australia in Mount Gambier. And we looked at 3 types of data inputs, and gave each one of them a bell voice, and then we put the bell voice with speakers, of course, not with a gigantic bell, but with speakers, into the cave, and we let all these bells ring out the flow of water through the city of Mount Gambier. And we looked at 3 data streams. The Piccaninny Pond's water egress, they measure that, at the water that goes from the pond back into the ocean. The Portland sea water level, and the variation of seawater levels at the shore, and then of course also the Mount Gambier rainfall. Later on, we also added the municipal water flow, and so you could see 3 or 4 water flows overlaid in a musical composition, and it was quite lovely to listen to, I thought, because these things, although they're on different time scales, and you could say that there's a lot of fallacy there, but it's all about water flowing, and so it was more of a poetic representation of data. A slightly less poetic, slightly more precise was my analysis of Chris Chafe of Vostok ice core data, and we did several things with it. First, we made a ice core walk, and we also made a sonification of climate data, where you could see how CO2 and temperature change over time. And this is a very long time, because the ice core has samples of CO2 frozen in it that go back to about 800,000 years before our common era, and we made a whole story out of that. It was a lot of fun. And you can still listen to it today on the website. Vostok Ice Core Walk is what it's called, icecorewalk.com. And in the last phase here is, of course, where industrial revolution happens, climate change, and you see for the first time a kind of a flipping where the temperature rises rapidly, and it actually drives a increase in CO2. Sorry, I said that wrong. The CO2 increase drives an increase in temperature, whereas normally it's the other way around. Normally, a increase in temperature provokes an increase in CO2, and we see that throughout the planet's history. CO2 levels did change dramatically throughout the planet's history, but I want to observe that in the past 10,000 years or so, climate has been very, very stable, which probably led to the development of agriculture and the development of human society as we know it. But this stability is about to come apart, and we're witnessing that right now through climate change. Because, as I said, the influences have been reversed. Now, a rising CO2 for the first time produces a rise in temperature. I think I want to end with this last slide here, and this last slide kind of closes the circle. This is a data manifestation of 200 years of colonization in Australia, and this is a work of art made in 1988 by contemporary Aboriginal artists who carved these tree trunks that are hollowed out by termites and often used to store the ashes of the deceased. In this case, there are no ashes of any deceased in here, but instead there are exactly 200 tree trunks that mark the 200 years of Western colonization of Australia. And they kind of create a pattern and a song, and the fact that there are 200, of course, indicates that it's some kind of data collection, some kind of data visualization that's going on. We can visualize the 200 years, but we can also visualize 200 years of resistance against colonization, because Aboriginal culture, although greatly decimated, managed to survive in some forms and thrive and produce new forms of art, such as what we see here. So this is both a work of art and a data visualization, and in the best of cases, this kind of work changes the way we think about maybe colonization. Maybe it allows us to think more inclusively about who lives where and what kind of different cultures people celebrate, engage in, and adopt, and preserve, and also innovate and create. And so that kind of vision of the future is one that gives me a lot of hope that we can learn from data. And speaking of learning from data, I'm going to quickly show you just this one clip from the Ice Core Walk. And I'm going to let that ring out the session here. And thank you so much for your attention. So I'm going to play this data visualization where you see the data and you'll see the dots moving here, but at the same time, you'll also hear the sound playing, a sonification of the CO2 temperature, and as a CO2 level and the temperature in the past 800 years or so. So actually 1,200 years. So this is a section of the Lake Vostok data. And the full tour is here. You can download the file and go for a walk. It's a lovely experience as well, where the data we listen to and the data we see as we walk around overlap in interesting ways. Enough said, here goes some music. Thank you so much for your attention. Wow, that always shocks me. And I'm going to stop share for a moment. I wanted to just summarize. Thanks again for checking this out, and appreciate the chance to talk to you about data cultures. I want to summarize that a data culture can include data that acts as a mirror, increasing our awareness of ourselves, but also as a window where we can increase our awareness of people around us. But unfortunately, it also can act as a block, neither a mirror nor a window, but a wall, something that prevents us from seeing what's going on around us because the data is obstructing our awareness of what's going on. And whether it's a wall, a mirror, or a window depends on our data models. It depends on how we collect data. It depends on how we tag data, how we create categories, and how we quantify data, and how we store it and share it, and whether it's a stream or whether it's a set object of data. And finally, how we're able to leverage the data to take action in the world, and how we can communicate the data so other people can take action in the world, not just ourselves. So how can we broaden access to true data? How can we broaden access to the mirrors? How can we broaden access to the windows that data can provide to as many people as possible for the greatest possible benefit? That would be the subject of data culture, and I hope that together we can build that and support that. And thank you so much for listening in today. Hope you have a great day. And if you want to reach me, I'm Niemeyer at berkeley.edu. And such a pleasure to speak to you today. Thanks for your attention and participation. Take care. Goodbye.